Day 4. We had begun the day at the base of the Katla and Eyjafjallajökull volcanoes and climbed our way gradually up their rocky slopes, and were now resting in the scattered snowfields of the Fimmvörðuháls Pass. After a short stop to eat and hydrate among the clouds, we were on our way again, the land folding up and down beneath our feet, contributing to a slow descent of the southern face of the volcanoes. The mix of sand, rock, and ice underfoot made the going tough. The ground was slippery and uneven as we traversed the steep gullies that cut their way across our path as we continued our way towards Skógar. The ragged clouds formed a roof that got gradually higher above our heads as we pressed on, until eventually the terrain sloped away in front of us and we could see, far off in the distance, where the land met the ocean. It appeared tantalizingly within reach, but it would still take a full day's worth of walking before we made it to our endpoint. After hours spent above the snow line in a monochromatic world of ice and rock, the colour was slowly starting to return. Just as the land had given way to the sea, the clouds had begun to break apart and give way to an ocean of sky, and the quintessentially Icelandic mosses were starting to thrive along the banks of the Skógar River. We refilled our water bottles from the river and then allowed it to guide us towards our distant goal, as it intermittently stepped down in small cascades, running along its bed of deep black volcanic rock. The river's path was deeply embedded and its course wouldn't change, and now that we were much closer to civilization, permanent bridges had been built and maintained. We wouldn't be getting our feet wet again for the rest of the journey. We had paced ourselves through the course of the day, stopping regularly to catch our breath. But the effort had taken its toll on Luke, who had woken up that morning feeling nauseous. But despite this, we had made it across one of the biggest challenges the Laugavegur Trail had in store for us, and had pushed hard, covering a considerable distance. It wasn't until we were clear of the snows and on the home stretch that the sickness finally caught up with Luke. We decided now would be the best time to make camp and get some rest. But before turning in for the night, and with the sun hanging low in the sky, I decided to spend some time perched above the falls of Skeiðarfoss and enjoy a good book. We set off the next morning with high spirits. After a night of rest, Luke felt well enough to travel, and we had a much shorter distance to cover today than any previous day. The sun poured into the river valleys that were being fed by the numerous waterfalls that tumbled down the banks, and clouds formed and rolled over the mountains that climbed upwards to the west. Seeing the snowfields that blanketed their peaks, I felt relieved as the sunlight warmed my back and filled me with energy, knowing I wouldn't have to trudge through any more ice or snow. The gentle descent south was accompanied by new waterfalls to admire over every rise and around every bend of the river, some cascading into dark pools that spilled over the precipice and out of sight. The wide open banks of the river got increasingly steeper, until eventually the river surged through a narrow gorge whose bottom was difficult to see through the spray of the waterfalls. And above us the clouds turned grey and heavy with the threat of rain, but with the end of the trail only a few miles away, we weren't too concerned, as we would have a roof and 4 walls to sleep under at the end of the day instead of a tarp. Whether through fatigue or because I knew my time in Iceland was coming to an end, my pace slowed, and I savoured every step along the increasingly weathered path. The trail had started to show more signs of life, with well-trodden tracks that had been maintained, buildings sporadically coming into view on the distant flats, and the occasional hiker passing us, moving up the mountainside with fresh smiling faces. As we approached the end of the trail, with the river widening, one group of hikers who were travelling the same route but in the opposite direction told us that the weather forecast looked grim for the next 4 days. And, as predicted, there was near enough constant downfall from the moment I got on the bus back to Reykjavik until I boarded my plane nearly 2 days later. We had certainly been lucky with the weather, all things considered. The trail was throwing one last challenge at us before we reached its terminus. Small hillocks waved along the banks of the river, forcing us to make a number of small climbs and descents. My lungs and feet burned as I pushed through, knowing that the end was just a stone's throw away. With each small summit, we expected to reach the edge of the shelf above Skogar, but our goal remained out of sight until the very last moment. As if my body could sense the finish line mere meters away, I started to ache all over, and my knees creaked with every step down the rickety staircase that led to the base of Skogafoss. But despite the protest from my joints, we'd made it. After nearly 60 miles of rivers, mountains, volcanoes and deserts, unrelenting sun and bitter rain, we had made it to Skogar with barely 30 minutes to spare before the only bus for the day could take us back to Reykjavik. We mingled amongst the throng of tourists and took in the power and majesty of Skogafoss. I traced our path up to this point in the map in my head, and contemplated one of the hardest journeys I'd ever made. The joy of reaching the finish line intermingled with an almost melancholic feeling that it was all over. But ultimately, the sense of accomplishment outweighed it all. And as I stood there underneath the torrent, that feeling nearly overcame how tired I was, and for a moment, I felt ready to do it all over again. But the allure of a hot shower and a soft bed waiting for me in Reykjavik was eventually all I could think about. Iceland is a land of opposites and juxtapositions. It's where fire meets ice. It's inhospitable yet undeniably beautiful. It appears almost prehistoric and ancient, yet, geologically speaking, it's one of the youngest land masses on the planet, having formed a mere 25 million years ago. It's still forming today, as demonstrated by the creation of Magni and Modi in the eruptions of March 2010. And Death Stranding's in-universe explanation for North America seemingly being Iceland is that the land is also young, its time having been stolen away by the rain, shaped through the violence of void-outs, torn apart and rebirthed into something new but primordial. These dichotomies are present all throughout Death Stranding as well. Life and death being inextricably intertwined, hope in the face of the hopelessness of extinction, the importance of the soul and the body, the ha and the ka, being a prominent concept in its lore. The old rely on the young to navigate the perils of this new and dangerous world, acting as their bridge to the future. The necessity to form connections and bonds while playing as a protagonist who is literally unable to make physical contact with the living or with the dead, because it causes a matter-antimatter reaction that can level cities. Iceland serves as the perfect backdrop for a game like Death Stranding, and after experiencing it in as close to the way Sam does as I could, by spending 5 days hauling myself and my heavy backpack across its formidable and awesome terrain, I was certainly able to see how Kojima's vacation to the country in 2014 was able to inspire and influence Death Stranding's world, its lore and music, but also its gameplay mechanics too. Death Stranding's moment-to-moment gameplay at its core is about navigation and traversal, or to put it in a way that has been used with negative connotations, it's a walking simulator, and I don't necessarily want to shy away from describing it as such. You don't simply get from A to B by pressing W or holding down the analog stick. The vast majority of your time in-game will be spent navigating the challenges of your journey from A to B. It's not simply a map with outposts to travel between, completing your objectives at each point before moving on to the next, with the occasional enemy or distraction in between, or providing a screenshot-worthy vista. It's not just a pretty world, and this concept that is so ubiquitous across almost all open-world games is flipped entirely on its head with Death Stranding. It's the spaces between point A and point B that are the challenge, and the primary reason for the open-world nature of Death Stranding. The vistas are hard-earned. From the smallest boulder to the tallest cliff, vast rivers or deep canyons, the world itself is what needs to be beaten and overcome by planning your routes and ensuring you have the right gear to conquer these obstacles and terrain features. Ensuring that the gear is kept in working order and is packed and arranged optimally to maintain balance. And in that respect, Death Stranding excels at being a walking simulator by offering well thought out and fun mechanisms that approximate real-life hiking and land navigation. And when the world is more than just a set piece, but is intrinsic to the story, its themes, and gameplay mechanics alike, Iceland has the character and diversity of terrain that fits this end perfectly.